Hey, thanks for tuning in. Steve Wolfson is back to talk about evolutionary astrology. And today we are going to, and Steve is going to present on Uranus. So, the outer planets have already been a great deal of knowledge, source of knowledge, at least to me, because I have a very predominantly Vedic astrology background, and I still don't use outer planets in my regular research or practice. Thanks, Steve, for joining, and it's been a wonderful time, and I'm sure we are going to enjoy this.
Thank you. That was interesting. I look at the outer planets as the energies that affect all of humanity, the whole world. How the planet itself, how consciousness itself on the planet is evolving over time. The inner planets are more, I see them as more personal. In other words, how I'm being affected by the overall trends. It's like the consciousness or awareness on the planet itself evolves over time. And that the outer planets represent the overall evolution of the planet as part of the divine plan, where this is all going. They actually, because of this, for me personally, I actually spend more time with the outer planets, with people, because I want to see how they're being affected by these overall trends. And their personal planets I interpret in relation to the outer planets. Because it's like there's something going on. Let me see, how do I describe this? Let's say we're in a country and there's a movement in the country, like a country that is ripe for change. And the ripeness for change is it's like there's something in the air. People are getting into a feeling, a thought, an energy of change, of, hey, we need to change this, or we don't like this anymore, we want to do something about it. And that's an impulse that a whole lot of people feel at the same time. And that to me is an example of an outer planet kind of energy. Then each person that's feeling that deeper sense of change or growth is going to bring it forth in a different way. Some people feel more drawn to what you might call a spiritual direction. Some people feel more drawn to a political direction. Some people feel more drawn to maybe an environmental direction. And that I equate more how they're going to bring forth or manifest these overall trends relates to their personal planets. It's the way they're interpreting the trend that they're feeling. So that's a value I find in the outer planets. Uranus, I pronounce it Uranus. It's a very interesting planet. It's associated with all the strange and weird stuff. And I've noted for a long time, it's the only planet, at least in English, it's the only planet that people pronounce in different ways. I mean, there are 4 or 5 ways you can pronounce Uranus, 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 Uranus. I don't see that as an accident. The way that Jeffrey Wolf Green taught Uranus, he wrote a little book about Uranus, actually. It's the only other book about a planet he wrote other than Pluto. This one, it's much shorter. He basically said Uranus is always working in conjunction with Saturn. And Saturn represents the outer structure of what we know, but I know the culture we're in. What is there, for example, what is there about India and then the United States, and why are they different? And where are they similar and where are they not? And the way that the structure is put together, that's Saturn. The way it's put together at this time, and that would include everything from the past that has gotten the culture to where it is now. That's what's known. Now, consciousness and life are not standing still. Everything is changing all the time. We as human beings, our sense of safety, security, is pretty much based on what I know, who I am, how things are done. This is why when periods of change come around, there's often a resistance in a lot of people who don't want to see the old ways go, because that's what I'm familiar with. And I'm not familiar with whatever it's changing into. This is also generational stuff where young people and the old people don't know why the young people aren't happy with the old ways, and the young people want to know why these old people don't get out of their way and let them create life the way they want it. And then the young people grow up and become the next generation of the old people who want to stop the young people from expressing themselves. That's kind of Saturn stuff. It's what we know. And it needs to be there. It's that way on purpose. Uranus represents what's beyond what we know. Life is continually changing. A really simple example of that that's coming to mind is that most places have seasons in a year. And, you know, I may love summer. I may love winter. And no matter how much I love a season, it's going to end. And no matter, you know, I mean, some people love winter and some people can't wait for winter to be over. So winter is going to be over and winter is going to come again the following year. Same with summer. This is change, and no two summers or winters are exactly the same anywhere. But there's a cycle going on. And the changes that occur within the different parts of that cycle is how evolution or growth plays out. So Uranus represents what's beyond what we know. We pretty much know what's going to happen, you know, in any given place, part of the world. We know more or less what summer's going to be like. We know more or less what winter's going to be like, until it starts changing. It's a really good example because out where I live on the West Coast, I'm just north of California. All of a sudden, we're having really bad fires, summer after summer. This didn't used to be in the program the way it is. In a way, it's Uranian because it's kind of unexpected change. And it's messing up the status quo. A large part of the economy around where I live and down into Northern California is based on tourism. And like last summer, we had about 12 weeks of smoke every day. Tourists didn't like this. This affected the economy. That affects people's security, safety, and the sense of knowing that, well, I know what's going to happen in the summer. Well, we don't know anymore. From the perspective I look at things at increasingly, everything that happens is part of evolution. Sometimes life shakes things up because whether we like it or not, life is changing around us all the time. Sometimes the changes are small, sometimes the changes are much larger. Uranus is like the leading edge of what's coming, where we're going. And where we're going is unknown, it's not known. If I move, say I move to another state in the United States or to Canada or even to another country, I don't know what's going to happen there. It's an unknown. I don't know. In order to move into an unknown, we deal with various emotions, fear, insecurity, and so forth. Life is doing that to us all the time because growth, the definition of growth is moving from what I know into what I don't yet know. And that is often scary at times for people. The more insecure or traumatized a person feels, the more likely that a large movement is going to be upsetting to them or difficult because we don't feel safe. But Uranus, the way that Jeffrey described it, that Uranus represents the individuation process. And in Jungian terms of psychology, individuating from the collective. And also the deconditioning.
So just getting back to what you said previously, in terms of getting into a zone where you are necessarily or essentially moving somewhere to understand what you did not know or probably what you were not necessarily used to in your regular life before that. So I was just reminded of a phrase that Robert Wilkinson used to say. Robert Wilkinson is an astrologer from Arizona, and I've been he's almost like a father figure to me, and he has given a lot of like phrases which I've copied, and one of those phrases is I've saved it in my laptop everywhere. So one of those phrases is that astrology helps us to navigate or understand the ignorant part of us. Like it's a path from ignorance to understanding. So that's what you mean to say what Uranus leads us to, or Uranus has a specific role in terms of putting us in an uncomfortable zone or a not so used to zone in terms of what we realize and what we understand or what we know newly, because Uranus is all about new changes as it is.
Yes, it's what's new that's coming in.
Which might not be, at least change is not always comfortable, or probably change is never comfortable at the beginning. So it's not that a situation is good or bad, but it is just that I think it is an illusion where Uranus kind of puts us in a situation where we ought to do something or we ought to learn that in order to navigate through that particular phase of our life.
Right. Yeah, I would say the way I look at it now, I'm kind of taking the word ought out of my vocabulary. The way I would put it is, this is what life has in store. It's a destiny.
Okay.
So there's a lot in, this is a little bit of a digression, but there's a lot in astrology of shoulds and shouldn'ts and oughts and musts and supposed to's. And I'm kind of taking that perspective out of my life because things are simply going to occur. Events are going to occur. I don't necessarily have to do work to have them happen. just occur. And then in some ways I'm left, in other words, I don't understand it. Example, out of the blue, a child loses a parent, death, or a parent loses a child, death. What am I supposed to do with that? Who's equipped for that? Nobody. And yet, out of having to deal with it, same with an accident. I'm a very healthy, stocky person, and I'm in a car accident, and all of a sudden, I can't use my leg or something. Who's equipped for that? What do I do? And the circumstance that occurs over time causes the necessary evolution. And there's the stages. You know, we've heard about the 5 stages of grief. Well, we may think of grief associated with death or things like that, but it applies to everything. Because when we're circumstances suddenly force us, we can no longer go on being who we were, living the way we were, because the circumstances that allowed that simply disappear. There's a big example of that. About 3 hours from, I was speaking about the fires. About 3 hours from where I live, south, is a town called Paradise in California. Now, Paradise is a very, that's like heaven. Well, last summer, 90% of Paradise burnt. Gone. In 2-3 days, gone. And, I heard someone speak, I've met a few people that survived that fire that actually moved here. And someone was speaking about that in tears. Their entire, she was probably a woman in her late 20s, early 30s. My entire life is gone. Everything about my parents' house is gone. My school is gone. All the stores I grew up with are gone. Just gone, gone, gone. What am I supposed to do with that? A few years back, now these are extreme cases. I'm not saying everybody has to go through this. Some years back, I read about, there was an earthquake in China, and there was pictures there, a 70-year-old man and his house, his wife, all his kids gone in this earthquake. The whole village he grew up in and lived in, gone. And he's standing there.
Okay.
What am I supposed to do? These are extreme cases. Now, in other words, your life's going to be remade from an experience like that. And most likely, in extreme examples like that, you're going to experience trauma. Trauma is very much a Uranian archetype. In evolutionary astrology, we closely associate trauma with Aquarius, 11th house, Uranus. And part of this is because of the extent or degree of change that Uranus can bring in.
One moment. Is there a specific rationale as to why Uranus, Aquarius is associated with trauma?
Yes. 11th house, all of the Aquarian, 11th house, Aquarius, Uranus, associated with trauma.
Okay.
Now, some of the, the correlations that we have for Uranus, Aquarius, 11th house include detachment, emotional detachment, dissociation. These are survival skills, or not survival strategies, I would put it. This is in essence what trauma is. I look at it kind of like Uranus, those archetypes are also connected with our nervous system.
I mean, do you think the experiences that a native could go through due to such particular placement will undergo some kind of uh, mental troubles, which could be traumatic in many ways? It's just an experience that a person feels at an emotional or a mental level rather than a physical level.
Yes, there can be physical trauma also.
Okay.
The gist of it is that this is, Uranus, Aquarius, 11th house is associated with the brain, the nervous system. And the way I visualize it is, think about wires, like in a house, your electricity in a house. If more current goes through that wire than the wire is rated at,
Mm-hmm.
it just kind of melts down. In the house, it could start a fire. The emotional experiences we can have from experiences that traumatize us are almost, there's too much voltage literally going through our nervous system. The nervous system can't handle it. It doesn't know what to do. It shuts down. That's trauma. So to survive, it just kind of blocks out the traumatic events. I mean, this is PTSD, people that come back from war and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
It blocks out what's gone on because the body is trying to survive, is trying to keep going. So one of the big, because Uranus is associated with sudden, shocking, unexpected events, it can often result in traumatic experiences. They don't have to be external experiences of fires and wars and all this. They can be shocking things in a home. Being betrayed, which betrayal is a Scorpio archetype, but the emotional response to being betrayed can certainly be traumatic.
Uh-huh.
The healing from all of this, which is part of the deconditioning, I don't know if I mentioned that word, but Uranus is about breaking through conditioning. I should speak for a little bit. What is conditioning? Going to, let's get spiritual for a moment. So at the deepest level, this assumes we have a soul, and that soul is putting itself into a human body, into a child, and that it has a life plan or life purpose that is unique to that person. Nobody else has that. We are then, in order to be born, we come into a family. That family has its conditioning. The family is part of a country that looks at life in a certain way. That part of the country, regional. That part of the country is also part of the whole country, and the whole country has its own flavor. In other words, if you are born in India, you're going to have a very different outlook on a lot of things than if you're born in the United States.
Uh-huh. Yes.
Not even, it's kind of like in the water. That's what you are surrounded by. That's how you grow up. The view of life, the perspective of life, what you're supposed to do with your life, what is society considers normal and good and healthful and all this. The people in that family have their own preconceived ideas of how they would like their children to grow up, what they want to see their children doing, what they want to see their children not doing. And yet each person, each child, has its own unique reason for being born at the soul level. This tends to get conditioned or overridden by the training it receives from the family it's born in, from the school it went to, from the teachers it had, from the society at large. In the United States, for example, you know, we have in the last 10 years at least, very strong political division between almost polar opposite, this side and that side. And if you're born into a family that's on this side, you're going to be subjected to a whole bunch of beliefs that are very different than if you're in a family that's born on this side. And the child may intrinsically in himself have beliefs that either are aligned with those that he's born into or are very much not aligned with those that they're born into. This is all part of our conditioning. So to me, part of the spiritual growth process is deconditioning all of the meditating and practices and so forth that people do is really trying to break the conditioning that they have received so that they can experience from within, who am I? What am I supposed to be doing? Why am I here? Who am I? What am I? Uranus is about breaking the conditioning, that I get back to my essential self. Now as we grow, part of the conditioning is that, you know, it's one thing to believe that there's a soul and to know that I'm a soul, and it's another thing to experience myself that I am a soul. So to me, on a deeper level, the deconditioning is removing the very sense that I am separate from the other 7 billion people that are walking around the planet. And I have an individual identity, yes, but am I, you know, like in the economic system we have here, for the most part, it's like I get to collect whatever I want for myself, regardless of how that affects anyone else. And that's a very deep conditioning. And so it's part of, Uranus is working to break these things down. We don't necessarily like them when they're breaking down. Another elements of Uranus, it's associated with what we call genius. And what is genius really? But somebody that sees more ahead of their time. There are people that are tuned into what you might say, where the world is going, beyond where the world is. Now, where the world is now is the Saturn. That's the conditioning. So your so-called geniuses, and which is in every facet of life. You can have, I mean, Einstein is considered a genius. What was it about Einstein? He was able to see there's more going on than people were recognizing at that time. He was tuned into that channel of the universe, what I call the universal mind. And he broke through enough of his conditioning, which would say, no, that's not the way it works. Another really good example that just came to mind is we had Columbus, you know, in 1492, sailed to the New World. And apparently in 1491, most people thought the world is flat. It's going to fall over the edge. Columbus had a vision, that's not true. doesn't, I mean, today it sounds funny and silly, but it was a lot of courage to convince somebody to pay for boats and convince people to get on the boats with him when they're deeply afraid they're going to fall off the end of the world and, die. And that's being tuned into something that's ahead of its time. As a result of that, gradually it became common belief that the world is round. There was a guy, I forget the year, 1500s, I think, Copernicus, who was what we would call an astronomer. And the Catholic Church, which at that time was the big reigning power in Europe, believed that the Earth was the center of the solar system and of the whole universe, and the sun revolved around the Earth. And Copernicus said, no, that's not the way it works. He was sent to jail. He was in prison for this belief, for teaching this belief. When you see where things are going, that's a form of genius, and that's a Uranian archetype. There are people who are ahead of their time. They come here, this is my perspective, there are souls who come here to help advance the evolution of the planet. We could say Buddha, Jesus, Krishna, were people who came. I mean, now we think they're wonderful. They didn't necessarily think they were so wonderful at the time because they were rocking the boat. And this goes back to what we know being the source of what feels secure. So people who shake up our known reality oftentimes meet a lot of opposition. That also is where the trauma occurs in a Uranian sense. They are not, people who shake up what's known are often not greeted with open arms and appreciation. They're helping to advance the evolution of humanity. But let's just say there are, at this point in time and in our past, there are a lot of places in humanity that don't, would prefer not to grow.
Uh-huh. So, Stephen Forrest, in his book *The Inner Sky*, gives a kind of great gist of what is the function of Uranus. Is like the development of individuality, the development of the capacity to question authority, the transcendence of cultural and social programming. So, the transcendence of cultural and social program is pretty much close to what you're saying at this point, like people who are born far ahead of their times. So, like who live with a greater thought, someone who does things that is probably done only after 50 or 60 years.
Yes. This is the leading edge. And Uranus and Saturn, are always like this. And that's why the Saturn-Uranus cycle of transits is also very important. Because it is mapping out, how do I put this? So I was born at a time, probably because it matches the way I am, where I was coming of age in what we now call the 1960s,
Okay.
which was a very wild and crazy time of experimentation. That actually was the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, which is the beginning of a cycle. And at that time, the young people, or many of the young people, were wanting to shake things up because the structure of things wasn't working anymore. The world was changing, and the circumstances in the world were changing, but the structures of the world didn't seem to be changing match. And so in the United States at that time, we had the two things. We had the civil rights movement and we had the Vietnam War.
Oh,
They're almost opposite each other. And the civil rights movement was basically about 100 years after slavery supposedly ended, people of color were still being treated as second and third class citizens. And that the time had come for this to change. And it was deeply, deeply embedded in the culture of the United States. And a lot of that, I mean, it still goes on, but it's not as subtle. I mean, it's more subtle now. It still goes on. And then the Vietnam War, which was just kind of what seemed like a very unjust war. There was not real reason to be having it. And this created social movements. Now at that time, because this stuff didn't exist here. I mean, this was the time when, for example, there had been, because we're talking about India, there had been a few people, spiritual people that had come from India prior to this time. But this was in the 1960s, was when the first real movement and kind of merging or association of the India culture and the United States culture began. And it was kind of a meeting of mindsets, because it was opening up the Western mindset, and it was seen in the United States at that time as very strange. Today now, it's been integrated into the mainstream. In other words, it's gone from being Uranian to being Saturnian. In other words, there are yoga studios everywhere now. There are health food in the US. There are health food stores everywhere now. These literally didn't exist at that time. Here and there, only in places where people that were artists and people who didn't conform were. And now it's been acclimated or integrated into the mainstream culture. At the same time, a little bit of the oomph, some of the oomph that was originally there, like the purity of the pure impulse, is kind of watered down in a lot of cases. It gets more commercial. There's a money-making element to it and all of this. That's because that's on the Saturnian place, that's where we are. We still have a lot of value on the making of money and the getting ahead and all of this. Here's a good example I thought of before. Earlier. So we're having some sort of ecological crisis on this planet on a large scale. In this country, we still have a lot of people and power and forces that want to believe that this has nothing to do with human behavior. It's just part of nature. It happens in cycles and blah, blah, blah. So the gist of it is, what it comes down to is, that's almost an irrelevant argument, because whether it's being caused by human behavior, which I personally fully believe it is, or natural cycles or some combination thereof, the reality that we have known on this planet is not going to be the same. The maps show in this country, even parts of New York City and a lot of Florida are going to be underwater in 30, 40, 50 years from rising ocean. So my point with it is that fighting about whose fault is it is sort of avoiding the whole issue. Making global treaties that everybody who's signing them agrees are not enough to actually resolve the problem, which is primarily because of economic reasons. Corporations that don't want to lose all the money and companies that don't want to invest countries that don't want to invest all the money. What's happening is a generation of people are being born that are young, that's the reality they're going to be living in. People being born now are going to be old around the year 2100. So in their lifetime, all this stuff is going to happen. So I already see that there are souls being born at this time that have within them the capacity, the insight, the intelligence, the connection, that we really got to approach this from a whole different angle, and we really need to do it right away. And there are solutions to the conditioned mind, which is the collective conditioned mind, may seem a little crazy, impractical, not going to work. And yet, the point is that the way we're going about it isn't working. So these people that are coming in, they're visionary kind of people. They're trying to save the future.